Hello everyone and welcome back. I am fresh off of a mental health break, feeling well rested, and I am ready to bring you a new true crime story. Oh, what a story it is. We've got so many elements to this story that are just primally terrifying. A nighttime intruder slaughtering families in their sleep, cults, voodoo, teenagers. Absolutely chilling stuff. Real quick, if you haven't been here before, my name's Rachel. Every week I come to you with a new true crime case, story, murder mystery, something like that. Usually I try to do this in the evening so we can have sort of a true crime and chill, and I usually just kind of do my nighttime skincare routine. Today you're getting makeup, and I do the makeup occasionally. I have other stuff to do today, so today it's a true crime get ready with me. If that kind of thing appeals to you, you can subscribe and give me a thumbs up on this video if you like it. So let me get my hair up here and we'll get started with the story of Clementine Barnebet, the voodoo cult murderess. Okay, well, my hair is just going to be what it is today. Just don't look at it too hard. It's not important. So Clementine Barnabet was only 17 years old when she was accused of committing some of the most heinous crimes in Louisiana history. And I know what you're thinking. Rachel, the last two cases you did were from Louisiana. I know, I'm stuck there. But for this case, we're going back in time more than 100 years. Warning, because this is such an old case, I did have to sort through some pretty old newspapers to find information, and the number of pictures I'm going to be able to provide is not as many as I would like, but that's just the nature of historic crime. Some of this you're just going to have to fill it in with your imagination. So nobody knows Clementine Barnabet's exact birthday, but it is thought that she was born around 1894. She was born in a place called St. Martinville, Louisiana, to parents Nina Porter and Raymond Barnebet. You'll notice her parents have different last names. It would seem that Nina and Raymond were kind of common law partners. They weren't legally married, which to me, it seems a little weird that for that time they would be not married, but apparently it wasn't all that uncommon at that time for people in Clementine's social class. She did have one brother named Zephyrin, who features pretty heavily in this story, and apparently she may have had some other siblings too, but I could not find any kind of information on their names or ages or anything like that, and they're not really involved with the story, so I don't want to say they're not important because that sounds mean. They're just not that pertinent to the story, so it's okay. As is so often true with these vintage cases, there's just not that much known about her childhood, except that Raymond, her father, was known to be physically abusive to the family. And really, not just necessarily to the family either. He was kind of known in their area as being a pretty violent man. He was not very popular in town. People generally didn't like him. As a matter of fact, later on when the police were looking for suspects in these cases, some of the neighbors described the family as filthy, shifty, and degenerate. So in a time and a place where your reputation would have been very, very important, the Barnabet family did not have a very good one. And other than that, their family life before the start of these crimes is just, there's a lot of blank spaces, which for that time, we're talking about the early 1900s at this point, not unusual. They were a poor, sharecropping family of color in Louisiana, and it's very probable that people in their situation rarely, if ever, would go to see a doctor, even for like birthing children. There was no social security numbers. A lot of people wouldn't have even had a birth certificate because they would have been born at home. This is the area that we are talking about. Rural, southern, impoverished. Unless they were in trouble with the law, there's just not necessarily going to be that much known. Like, why does my skin just turn bright red the minute that I touch it? So that brings us then to the first murder, about which there is some discrepancy. There are some people who consider a murder that happened in 1909 to be the first in this series of serial killings. In that year, Edna Lucis, there's a lot of Creole names in this, so so if I mispronounce it, I do apologize. But Edna Lucis and her 3 children were murdered in the year 1909. Later on down the road, the police did try to connect this murder of Edna and her children to the ones that they were pinning on Clementine Barnebet. There's a lot of unknown there. But generally, when people talk about the beginning of these murders, they are talking about the Byers family in 1911. The Byers family consisted of Walter, his wife, and their 6-year-old son. In February of 1911, they were all found in their home, hacked to death with an axe. Just 2 weeks after that, Alexander and Mimi Andrews were found, along with their children aged 3 and 11 months, killed in their home, and this time they had been elaborately posed. The sheriff said he could tell they had been killed in their beds, but then they were moved. He described them as having been brained with an axe, which is just like an old-timey way of saying their head was split open and or crushed with an axe. But the way that they found them posed was just really creepy. The husband and wife had been positioned kneeling next to the bed as if saying their nighttime prayers. Mimi's arm was placed over Alexander's shoulders as if she were comforting him, and little 11-month-old Agnes, the baby, had been laid on the bed next to her mother. And at this point, the authorities are recognizing that these crimes are connected in some way. At this time, they didn't really have a word for serial killer, but they said it was clear these crimes were being committed by the same monster. And Sheriff Lacoste, that was the sheriff in the county where they were investigating these crimes, Sheriff Lacoste was coming up with some theories. See, there was this man named Garcon Godfrey, and Garcon Godfrey had recently escaped an insane asylum and was on the loose. Now, this seems like a fairly obvious suspect. You have these horrific, brutal, terrible murders being committed, and then you have somebody who's an insane person, maybe criminally insane, who is at large, as it were. Just seems like a natural conclusion to come to, and they begin sort of a manhunt for Garcon. Now, why they weren't looking for him already, I don't know. It seems like if somebody escapes an insane asylum, maybe you go try to find that person. I don't really know why they weren't really looking for him in the first place. Be that as it may, they're looking for him now. And they don't find Garcon right away, but they are able to track down his mother, and she informs the authorities that he's actually not there. He's locked up in another facility. Hello, 1911 bookkeeping. I assume that they are able to confirm this. They actually arrested his mom. They arrested her in order to compel her to tell them where he was, and she was like, don't you guys already know? I mean, he's just locked up like somewhere else in the state. But you know, there's no computers, no database, so I guess sometimes things are just going to slip through the cracks. Regardless of the fact that he was basically incarcerated at the time, they did go ahead and go pick him up in connection with the murders of the Andrews and Byers families, but they were not able to connect him to either of the crimes. So eventually, Sheriff Lacoste and his little posse are turned in the direction of Raymond Barnabet. Supposedly, this information came to them from a friend of a woman who was Raymond's mistress. She had told this friend Raymond had confessed to killing the Andrews family. It really freaked her out, and so her friend then went to the authorities and said, hey, have you looked at Ray? There's not actually anything to confirm that telling of events is 100% true. If I had to take a guess, I would say that probably his neighbors were like, hey, have you looked at this guy over here? We don't like him very much. So they did like pick him up and they talked to him, but they didn't have any evidence to convince him. They just had this story that he supposedly told some woman. He denied the story. It was he said, she said, and so they had to let him go. And about a month after they let him go, another family is found murdered in a very similar way. This was the Cassidy family. They had 3 children. It was strange. It was ritualistic. There were buckets of blood all over the room that belonged to the family. They had been drained into these buckets. They were posed strangely and were just in general very difficult to look at. After the Castaway family is killed, they go ahead and they pick up Raymond again. And this time they put him on trial, and he's actually convicted in October of 1911, largely because of the eyewitness testimony of his son Zephyr and his 17-year-old daughter Clementine. They both got on the witness stand and testified that they had seen their father come home on the night the Andrews were killed, and he was covered in blood and bits of brain. Say that 3 times fast. They said that he woke them up to help clean up the mess, and he told them he, quote, killed the whole damn Andrews family. So Raymond gets sent to prison, and everybody is so relieved because these horrible, terrifying murders are finally going to stop. Except they don't. On November 26th, just the month after Raymond was sent to prison, right in Lafayette, Louisiana, where the Barnabet family lives, Norbert Randall, his wife, their children, and a nephew that was staying with them were slaughtered. It was completely similar to the others, buckets of blood, ritualistic style, axe killing, except Norbert, the father of the family, had been shot with a gun. This had not happened in any of the previous killings. So, since Raymond was in jail, he obviously could not have committed these crimes. And what does Sheriff Lacoste do? He heads straight to the Barnabet home looking for Zephyr and Clementine. And I don't know what it was about Clementine, but Lacoste had actually kind of suspected her pretty early on, probably because he says that when they had gone to search the Barnabet home, they had found a suit of women's clothing that was covered in blood and what they believed to be brain matter. Clementine made various claims on this. She was always changing her story. She made various claims on why she had this clothing that was covered in this stuff. She claimed first that it was period blood. And I love this. I think that Lizzie Borden also used this as an excuse because, like, in 1911, and I mean really today, people still aren't great about it, but in 1911 especially, you got a group of men and you told them that you had a dress that was soaked in blood, and you were like, it was my period. They'd be like, okay, and then we wouldn't want to talk about it. You could pretty much, as a female, get away with murder by just explaining away any blood as being your menstrual cycle. They just didn't want to talk about it. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. She told a bunch of stories about this. She also said at one point that her father had wiped the blood on her. Throughout this entire case, Clementine is always telling a story, telling a different story, changing it up, flip-flopping. She waffles more than ego. They do end up taking this suit of clothing, and this is where we actually get a little bit of forensic evidence. I know, right? Now it's 1911, so they don't have DNA or anything like that. But what they do is they take these clothes and they give it to this doctor. And this doctor has a look at the blood and a look at the chunky material in the blood, and he says this is not menstrual blood, and he says that the brain matter is brains. So that's it. He just sort of does a visual inspection and is like, yep, that sure is some brains. And that's it. That concludes the police evidence about these clothes. But for 1911, I think any forensic evidence is a good thing. So good for them. When the kids, Clementine and Zephyr, were questioned, Zephyr had a really solid alibi for the night of the most recent murder. But Clementine did not, and so she was arrested. However, even after Clementine and her father were behind bars, these ritualistic murders continued. In January of 1912, 3 more families would be killed. And once again, as is always the case with serial killings, they were able to connect that these murders were done by the same people because of the similar scene. Buckets of blood, posed, ritualistic style, axe killing. Then, a couple of these killings that look very much the same happen in Texas. So we're out of Louisiana now entirely. And they do not know what's going on. They've never dealt with anything like this. The people who have been convicted of committing these crimes are behind bars, so it's not them. And overall, they've just basically got nothing. Just a note, there were 2 families killed in Texas. Sorry, I'm just still not happy with my eyes. And I always do this, and then I go like too far, and I mess them up. All right, so I need to give you just a little bit more detail. I skipped over this part for the sake of storytelling, but one of the murders in January of 1912, we're going to revisit. This was kind of a special case, and when you look at these murders, this is one of the most talked about crime scenes. It was particularly brutal, and it was particularly strange. This happened in Lake Charles, Louisiana, to Felix Broussard, his wife, and their 2 children. This is the scene where the investigators really start to get the idea that these killings are religiously motivated. The first thing the investigators saw when they arrived on the scene was an inscription made in blood. It was on the wall, and it read, "When he maketh inquisition for the blood, he forgetteth not the cry of the humble." Now, if you think that that sounds biblical, you would be correct. It is paraphrased from the Bible, specifically Psalm 9, verse 12. I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm not even a Christian. But from what I could gather, the meaning of this part, it's basically saying that people who believe in God don't need to seek revenge, because God will make sure that anybody who oppressed them is punished. I don't know if that's important or not. Maybe you'll find it interesting. It doesn't really mean much to me. I don't really understand how that particular biblical passage plays into murdering a bunch of people. But this is obviously something that's very striking that the sheriff noticed right away. This inscription was also signed again in blood, "The Human 5." At this point, they're not sure if the Human 5 was a reference to the number of people being killed, because in a lot of cases, there were 5 people in the family, or if it was saying that there were 5 accomplices involved in the murders. And this is how we end up with Sheriff Lacoste kind of having this multi-killer theory. Of course, the media, the newspapers at the time, start referring to the killers as the Human 5, because that's how the media do. Even more creepy and disturbing than this cryptic inscription, the children's hands had sticks placed between their fingers to splay them apart like this. I'll try to throw up a picture. And nobody could understand why they would want the children's hands to be forced splayed open like this. They thought that it might have to do with literally just the number 5, that they were trying to force the children's hands to be kind of counting to 5. Weird. It's weird, and it's very disturbing and strange, and I hate it. I hate anything having to do with kids, really. I don't think anybody likes it. Just anybody who's the most vulnerable in the population, it's always a really sore point to me. Animals, old people, children. Anyway, so the press gets a hold of all of this, and of course, they have a field day. We like to think that the press is particularly bad now, and it is, but they've always been trying to sell newspapers, you know what I'm saying? So they'll take anything they can and grab it and run with it. The media is just running with this. And after this thing with the inscription and all of that, the newspapers start to print that these killings are part of a voodoo ritual. For some of us, voodoo seems like a far-off concept, but for people in Louisiana, especially at this time, voodoo was a very real and alive practice. I don't want to say it was commonplace. It was something known about, and for people who didn't practice it, it may have seemed very mysterious and very scary. So when the newspapers start printing stuff about a voodoo cult, understandably, people in these communities are freaked out. And these rumors about a voodoo cult really start to gain some traction when Clementine herself, from prison, decides to talk to investigators, and she confesses to being the leader of this voodoo cult. Now, I looked at all the newspaper clippings and all of the dates, and just because of the reporting at the time and because of the age of this case, I'm not sure if the press started making these suggestions about the voodoo cult and then Clementine said, yes, I'm the leader of a voodoo cult, or if Clementine was talking about it and then the press picked it up. That's not very clear. And Clementine's story, like I said, changes so many times. It's hard to know what's true and what's not true, but ultimately, she ends up confessing to orchestrating the murder of 35 people and claims that 17 of those 35 she killed herself. She tells the authorities that she received, in her words, a hoodoo or a conjure, it's reported both ways, from a local voodoo priest. So I don't want to turn this into a history lesson about voodoo, especially because I don't know enough about it to give a history lesson on it. But hoodoo and conjure are, from my understanding, different things than voodoo as a practice. So voodoo is a religion with rites and rituals, and hoodoo or conjure is considered to be sort of folk magic. It's not closed, anyone can practice it. But it may have been common, or Clementine herself may not have known because she may not have actually been initiated into voodoo. She may just have thought these magic talisman or something that she received, she called it a hoodoo or a conjure, one of the two, and that was her name for it. So if anybody's out there who practices hoodoo or practices voodoo, I don't know. This is just what Clementine told the authorities, that a voodoo priest gave her some kind of medallion to wear to protect her. And because she had this magical amulet, she did not fear being caught for her crimes, because the amulet was supposed to prevent her from being detected. And then she points authorities in the direction of a man named Joseph Thibodeau, who she says is this voodoo priest who gave her the amulet. When questioned, Thibodeau was like, whoa, no, I'm not a voodoo priest. He just says he's an herbalist, naturopath person. He deals with roots and stuff like that. He's not involved in voodoo. Also, as far as I can tell, there weren't any laws against practicing voodoo anyway, so they didn't have anything to arrest him on or to charge him with, and they just kind of talked to him and let him go. Among Clementine's confessions, she goes further to say that this voodoo cult that she's actually a priestess. This little group of theirs is called the Church of Sacrifice. She also gave the motive for the killings, which were that in her church, they believed that by performing human sacrifice, they could become immortal. And she says that they killed people who had gone against the church. But as far as I could tell, no evidence was presented that she had actually known the victims previously to killing them. So how would she have known that they went against the church? That doesn't really make any sense to me. I don't know. Leave your theories in the comments below. She also gave several names because, of course, she said we're a group, right? That's why all these murders are happening. We're a whole group of people, and I'm going to give you the names of some of my accomplices. And so she does this. She gives authorities all of these names, and none of these people seem to exist. She never gives them anybody who they can actually track down. I'm sorry if I keep looking at my viewfinder, I'm looking at my makeup. So she never gives them the name of anybody who's findable. So my question is she covering for the other people in the cult, or is there no cult at all? I'm going to talk about that in a little bit because I have my own personal theories on this, and I would really love to discuss it. So I'll hold, but I have a theory. So among all of these people, she did give the police the name of a preacher called Reverend Thompson. And Reverend Thompson, I guess, was supposed to be somehow connected with the Church of Sacrifice that Clementine was supposedly a priestess of. The Atlanta Constitution, which is a paper down there, or at least was at the time, reported that when questioned, Reverend Thompson claimed that he had converted many people to what he called the sect of sacrifice. And that in his group, they believed that as soon as you become sanctified by which I assume he means you believe in their beliefs, you can no longer sin against God, regardless of what you do, even murder, if you are sanctified. But again, I'm not like a Christian scholar or anything, but isn't that kind of the idea? Like, if you accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, as long as you accept that, then really no matter what you do in life, you'll still be saved and like go to heaven. I could be wrong. Let me know in the comments. But that doesn't seem like that weird of a belief to me. And I don't know if anything ever really came of this line of questioning, but supposedly inside of his Bible, he had something written there. And it said, quote, "And now every axe is laid into the root of the tree. Therefore every tree which bringeth forth not good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire." That is very metal. That is some serious words. I don't know what it means. Again, to me, when you're talking about religious stuff, biblical stuff, it just doesn't seem that off base. There's weird allegorical hellfire and brimstone stuff all throughout Christianity, all throughout the Bible. So a phrase like this, that kind of allegorical thing, doesn't seem that sus to me. And apparently it didn't seem that suspicious to the police ever, because Reverend Thompson wasn't like arrested or charged with anything or suspected of anything, and really just nothing was done there. So even though Clementine is often regarded as the first African-American serial killer, and although she's always presented as the Voodoo priestess murderer who is responsible for the deaths of 35 people, some people, myself included, have some question as to what share in the responsibility she actually had, if any. Could this 17-year-old girl really have committed all of these horrifically violent crimes? Could she really have convinced other people to become part of this sacrificial cult? Unfortunately, we'll never really know what police did exactly to confirm that Clementine actually did what she said she did. Usually the police will, put out a report and you can find out more information about, like, here's how we confirmed that they were here, or we can show that during this time they were in this place. We don't know. We don't know what they did to confirm this. Her story was so outlandishly crazy. It also changed pretty frequently. There was also one little detail that I got hung up on, and I've not really seen anybody else mention this, but one of the reasons she was suspected and put in jail in the first place was because they found that suit of women's clothing that was covered in blood and brains. Clementine claims that when she was committing these crimes, she would dress like a man so that she could move around more freely at night without being suspicious. She could go on the train to travel to different places, etc. So if she wears men's clothing while she goes and commits these crimes, why was her women's clothing covered in blood? That doesn't make sense to me, and I don't have an answer for it, and I've not seen anybody give an answer for that. Kind of weird. The press made a lot of descriptions of her demeanor while she was testifying. By the way, she was in jail for a while before she confessed. She didn't just come out right away. Up to that point, she had been completely denying that she had anything to do with this. And then suddenly one day she just comes out with it and says, oh yeah, all of this stuff is true. But either way, the press describes her demeanor as completely emotionless and detached as she talks about how all of this stuff went down. They said that at times she even rolled her eyes in the back of her head and laughed wildly. It all sounds very theatrical. If you read the full typed out transcription of her confession, which I did, and I'll leave a link in the description to a place that you can find it so you can read it too. It sounds very rehearsed to me. It sounds very pre-written. We don't even actually know if Clementine Barnebet could read or write. Is it possible that she was told what to say? And this is kind of where I lean. After a while of the police having no suspects. They had 2 people they'd put in jail for these crimes. They still hadn't stopped. They didn't have any additional suspects. And I imagine they were under a lot of pressure to get this solved. So is it possible that the police coerced a confession out of Clementine Barnebet? I mean, we'll never know, but is it possible? I think it is. Or remember, this is a poor, abused young girl. Is it possible she just said it for the attention? That would not be unheard of. It is not unheard of for people to confess to things that they didn't do simply to get the spotlight on them. So despite all of the numerous names that Clementine gave the police for her accomplices, no one was ever found. And even though the whole thing was predicated on the fact that she was the leader of this cult, no one else was ever arrested in connection with the crimes. Don't you think that they would not stop with her and they would keep looking? But they didn't. No other arrests were ever made. In fact, the Lafayette Advertiser, which was a little local paper who printed her full confession, even added a caveat at the end of the article. They said, Clementine's confession has been received with varying shades of belief, owing to the positive way she swore in the trial of her father and the misleading information she has given as to her accomplices. Holy moly, that's shiny. Again, it's kind of hard to imagine why she would lie. But, like I said before, she might want attention. She might have felt guilty about testifying against her father and hoped that maybe if she confessed herself that they would let him go. But regardless of her actual guilt, the jury was quite convinced and they did sentence her to life in prison for her crimes. And so at the tender age of 19 years old, she was sent to live out the rest of her days in the Louisiana State Penitentiary. Yes! The very same penitentiary where 100 years later, Sean Vincent Gillis and Derek Todd Lee would be serving their sentences, which is how I ended up stuck on this case. I promise next week we're going to move on from Louisiana. So while she was in prison, Clementine was considered a model inmate, except she did make an escape attempt in 1913. Nobody really seemed too bothered by that. She didn't even get outside of the gates of the prison, apparently. It wasn't really that big of a deal, I guess. However, in 1923, barely 10 years after she had been convicted, she was released from her life sentence. And why was she released after serving only 10 years of a life sentence? Well, she was cured of her criminal tendencies, of course. It is stated that she had a medical procedure done that just cured her of her desire to commit crimes and kill people. It's not specified what this procedure exactly was, and it's kind of hotly debated because the obvious choice here is a frontal lobotomy, right? Where they go in through the eye and scramble up the front part of your brain, and it just kind of makes you docile for the rest of your life. But the problem with this is that the frontal lobotomy was not officially a procedure done in the United States until the 1930s. However, there's an argument to be made, and I heavily agree with this argument, that it didn't just come out of nowhere in the 1930s, right? People were practicing. So even though it might not have been official, it might not have even been legal, it's not a stretch to say that maybe some doctors and medical practitioners were practicing the lobotomy technique on people like prisoners' lips. So officially speaking, it was not a lobotomy, but what else could it possibly have been? It couldn't be anything else. Surely it couldn't be anything else. If you have any ideas, tell me, because I need to know. Then after she's released from prison, and she would have only been 29 years old at that time, she just disappears off the face of the earth. There's really nothing else said about her, with 2 small exceptions. Number 1 is that there's this crazy theory that she is the Axeman of New Orleans, which if you're a true crime person, I'm sure that you have heard of the Axeman of New Orleans. The problem with this little theory is that the Axeman of the New Orleans was active from 1918 to 1919. Clementine was solidly locked up at that point. Also, the motives are totally different. The victims are totally different. It really doesn't match up whatsoever. That theory doesn't really hold any water, especially since she was in prison at that time, to the best of our knowledge. So it's fun to think about. And the only other time she pops up is on Reddit. There's a Reddit thread, and we all know how Reddit is. I mean, like, anybody can write anything. It could be a complete fiction. But some woman was on there and had posted that she thought her grandmother was Clementine Barnebet. And she says she remembers that not long before her grandmother died, she had started telling her about the voodoo killings in Lafayette and all around Louisiana. And she seemed to know a lot about the case, or so says this Redditor. And later, after she died, they were going through old photos, and they found some photos of her grandmother when she was a young woman, and she says that the resemblance between her grandmother and young Clementine Barnebet are staggering. That being said, all the photos of Clementine, there's like one picture and it's kind of grainy, and almost anyone could look like that who has similar facial features, similar ethnicity, all of that. So, you know, take that for what it is. But that, my friends, is the story of Clementine Barnebet, voodoo priestess serial killer. Or was she? I really want to hear what people's theories are on this. If you want to see some of my source material, I will have links down in the description. Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. It really helps me out. And other than that, I will see you next time. Bye-bye.